I don't think any of us are very fond of going through airport security, especially these days since 9/11. And nowadays, you have to walk through the deal, and you take off your belt and take off your shoes and set all those things in a little thing along with your wallet and your keys and down the conveyor belt, and waiting for the long lines because it obviously takes longer for everybody now to have to go through that kind of a process. So I don't think any of us really love going through airport security. But if you'll picture this scene with me, this was 3 years ago, and it's Tel Aviv, the airport in Tel Aviv, Israel, and I was leaving after having spent a couple weeks there touring the West Bank and trying to get an idea of what's really going on rather than just seeing what this news says and this report says and these people say versus that people say, just to kind of get in there and see what's happening. That's another story for another time. I've shared that elsewhere, but it was about midnight, and I'd left my tour group back in Jerusalem. I was leaving, heading back home. And so it was about midnight when I arrived there at the airport in Tel Aviv. Taxi dropped me off, and I was dropped off. It's pretty quiet there, so I'm dropped off, and I start heading, inside to the terminal, and I was stopped by security, who had me go through a security check. They took my passport, looked through that, had me, take out my wallet, my keys, go through a little deep, like you're going to a concert kind of a thing. About that level of security check. So I went through and did that, and they let me in, let me through. So, and then I was shown which line to go through. I asked, where do I go? Right over here. So they sent me over to the line to pick up my tickets. And as I get in the line, I'm standing there for a minute or two, and I'm approached by some kind of airport security or personnel representative of some sort. They came and they asked me a few questions. They were asking, where have you been? And I said, I've been in Jerusalem and Bethlehem, which was true. And now I'd also been to Hebron, which I was told not to mention by our tour group. They said, don't mention it, because this is where the headquarters were, the group I was with, and they didn't want, attention and people not being allowed back through there. So anyway, so just let them know you've been to Jerusalem and Bethlehem and you've been doing the Holy Land tour. And so that's the story I stuck with. So he asked me then if I've been to Ramallah, which I could honestly answer no. We didn't go to Ramallah. So anyways, he gave me back my passport. He'd taken my passport to look at it, gave me back my passport, and said carry on, and sent me over to a different line. So I went over to the different line, and as I stood there, I was approached by yet another personnel, and this was a woman as I remember, she asked for my passport. I gave her my passport. She looked it over, asked me the same questions. Where have you been? Jerusalem, Bethlehem. Have you been to Ramallah? I said, no, I have not been to Ramallah. Now, having been asked a second time and being put in a second line, I was starting to get a little nervous. This was, I'd already spent 2 weeks. I've got other stories, right? I'd already spent 2 weeks in the West Bank, and so I'd been through checkpoints and kind of that being a bit of a nerve-wracking deal too. But anyway, this was like, what is going on here? They sent me to a separate line, checked my passport, asking me these questions over and over again, sending different people to ask the same questions. So I'm waiting in line. Yet another rep comes to me, asks me the same questions. I give them the same answers. They gave me my tickets. So, the 3 people have asked me this now. They still let me go through the line, gave me my tickets. A bit of relief. So then they send me on to the security check, the one that everybody goes through that nobody's excited about having to do. We all have to do this. No problem. So I'd already been through a mini one, right, a half hour earlier or so, just on the way into the airport. So I do the thing. I send my luggage through, wallet, keys. They have my passport, belt. Go through and do all of that. I walk through the scanner, no problem. I'm not carrying knives or anything crazy. So, but they pulled me aside and they sent me over to a special scanner that was a little further on down. No one else was at that scanner except a security person. No other people being sent there. So anyway, I'm sent over to that scanner where I'm asked to take off my shoes. I don't remember what else it was, but it was like a special. You had to go stand in a booth. So I was like standing in this booth going, what is this for? Realizing, of course, they've got all my stuff over there, right? But anyway, so I go through that, and I'm cleared for whatever they were looking for. I don't have anything hidden anywhere. And then I'm called over where they had my luggage, and the guy had my luggage opened up. So that conveyor belt you put all your luggage on, he's got it. The conveyor is stopped. He's popped. I mean, it wasn't busy, right? I was saying it's about midnight, so it's not too busy. But they just pop open my luggage, and started going through it. And I had some books in there that I bought at a bookstore there in Jerusalem, written by Palestinian Christians, and just their take on what's going on over there and that kind of thing. So I've got these books, and he starts going through it, and he goes, I can't do a very good Israeli accent, but anyway, Gaza children. Okay, that didn't sound Israeli at all, but he says something about Gaza children. I said, yeah. He said, well, why do you have a book about Gaza children? Got that sort of bookstore, and I'm a pastor. I explain I'm a pastor, and I want to be able to, share what, what's going on over here. There's an importance with Israel and Jerusalem, for Christians, and trying to understand how we relate to them and all of that. So I'm just trying to get some answers to those things, which was an honest response for me. And so anyway, he calls in, walkie-talkie, calls in another security person who comes over, and they're looking over my passport. He hands off my passport to this other guy. They said me, go sit down. They continue to go through my stuff. And that's when it hit me that this was getting real. Okay, we'd all been through security before, and maybe even pulled aside before, right? I'd had that happen to me right after 9/11. Katie and I went traveling at Christmas, right after September, 9/11, and we went traveling to Colorado, and we were pulled aside to a little room. But this was different. It just hit me that things were getting real. I was in a foreign land where I didn't speak the language. I was with no one. I had no representatives. The American embassy had no idea I'd been there. They weren't looking for me or tracking me or anything like that. I don't speak the language. I didn't have a phone. I didn't have my wallet. I didn't even have a belt or shoes. They had my passport. They had my tickets. Things weren't looking good for me. I just suddenly realized I'm at what am I gonna do? What can I do here if they do decide to take me aside to some room, carry me off? What am I gonna do? I mean, I could have, I suppose, I don't know. I mean, I was just suddenly, things are getting real, and I don't know what the next step was going to be, and I was getting kind of freaked out. And this is after 2 weeks of having been in, the other stories of having been in clashes and home invasion and AK-47 strapped around, these settlers on their way to prayer and looking at me funny, and all these different scenarios I'd already been through in the last 2 weeks, and now suddenly I just want to get home, and I'm left with nothing but a pair of shorts and my shirt and hope, and a prayer, because I realized if they'd wanted to carry me out, I couldn't have done anything. What would I have done about it? Kick them in the tenders and run in my socks, only to find that I've got nowhere to go and no means of doing anything, hailing a taxi with no money and so on and so forth. So anyway, things, in that moment got real for me. Now, they did send me through. Obviously, I'm here. They sent me through. They kept my backpack. So they took everything out of my backpack. I didn't have luggage. I just had a backpack. So they took everything out of the backpack, the books and my clothes, everything else, put it in a new bag. Their bag. I still have it. I don't have it here. Yeah, I do. No, I don't. Anyway, it's a neat bag. I'm going to keep it as a little souvenir. But they put all my stuff in that bag, kind of stuffed it all in there, and said that they would send my backpack along on a separate flight. Now, I understand, with terrorism and especially over there, and I had a little more beard, and a bit more of a tan perhaps, and maybe looked like somebody that was going to do something. I don't know what it was, but actually I think I do know what it was. They know I was lying, that I'd been in different places, because they'd been looking at my passport through the checkpoints for the last 2 weeks. These guys knew what was going on and knew I was lying. Anyway, but I was nervous about it and didn't know what to do, but they let me through, sent my backpack on another flight. I never picked it up because I wasn't interested at that point to go back to SeaTac and get my airport. So anyway, quite an experience, but and I got to San Francisco 15 hours later, kissed the ground. I was so happy to be back home and safe and people speaking my language and everything else, and kind of felt like I was in control of my life again. So all that story, just to say, this was a time in my life when things got real. Like, this is a real moment. This is real danger. This is a situation that could get, out of my control, and it was a little freaky. We're getting to that point of the book of John now where things are going to get real, and that's why I share that story. Things are going to get real for Jesus, and he knows that. He knows that the miracles are over. The dialogue, much of his dialogue and teaching has already happened. There's not much room for that left. The hour has come that the Son of Man be glorified. And things are going to change. Things are going to get real very fast. His betrayal, Peter's denial, and the arrest, and of course the crucifixion. All of that is coming up in a matter of, a day or so. And so things are getting real for Jesus. Things are getting real here in the book of John. Last week I cut Jesus off mid-conversation, and as us preachers often do, to say it's got to stop here. So I stopped at verse 26, but Jesus wasn't done. We stopped because of time, but Jesus didn't stop there. So we're going to pick up this week in mid-conversation. And Jesus has just arrived in Jerusalem, big crowds, right? The palm branches, all that stuff I was explaining last week. They were excited. The people thought, hey, this is a miracle worker. He's the guy that's going to, bring a miracle about and give us, freedom from oppression from Rome. Jesus had bigger plans, which I was also trying to explain. Now, the religious leaders were not happy about the crowd's enthusiasm. The whole world has gone after him, so they're even more upset. As they speak of the whole world going after him, some Greeks approach Philip and want to see Jesus. Jesus' response to that was to talk about the hour of the Son of Man to be glorified has come. So he doesn't go and speak to them. And instead he starts speaking about the grain of wheat that falls to the ground and dies, Unless it dies, this is how it produces more fruit. And so Jesus is speaking of his death. He begins to speak of the disciples' possible death also by following him, just that they must go to wherever he goes, to whatever lengths he ministers, they must be willing to go also. But anyway, as we continue on, like I said, mid-conversation, his mind is still on the crucifixion. The hour has come. The hour that hadn't come at the wedding, hadn't come when he slipped through their fingers over and over again over the years. But now the hour has come, and so this is the time, and Jesus knows things are getting real. So as he's speaking, this is where we pick up now in verse 27. His mind is on the coming crucifixion. Jesus says, "Now my soul is troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour. But for this purpose I came to this hour. Father, glorify your name." Let me stop there. This is Jesus's. It's an interesting. There are a number of interesting statements as we're going to go through here, but this might strike you as strange. It strikes me as a strange statement. And what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? The reason it strikes me as a strange statement is because it seems to be the opposite of what, say, like Matthew shares in his gospel, where Jesus, before the crucifixion, goes to a garden to pray. He invites his disciples, his top guys, hey, come and pray with me, and they all fall asleep. Remember that one? So 3 times he goes and prays the same thing. 3 times, in case we missed it the first time, it's repeated. This is what he prayed. He prayed, "Oh, my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." Very famous prayer from Jesus, right? If this cup may pass from me. In John, it seems that he's saying the very opposite. Like he's not about to pray that prayer. Now my soul is troubled, what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? But for this purpose I came to this hour. Father, glorify your name. So it sounds as though, the way that it's put here, it sounds as though he's saying, what shall I pray? What shall I say to God? Shall I say, Father, save me from this hour? I mean, like, why would I say that? Because I've come for this hour. So I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't pray that. And it seems to be exactly the opposite of what's shared in the other Gospels. My take on this is that I believe that it's simply a translation error. Nothing wrong with the manuscripts, anything like that. But translators make decisions as they read through whether to put a question mark, how to punctuate things. And so in this case, they've chosen a question mark. Father, what shall I say? Question. Father, save me from this hour? Question mark. Hear it with a period. Okay, I'm reading for the New King James, which has a question mark, but hear it with a period. Now my soul is troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour. That is, I think, John's equivalent saying to Matthew's, having Jesus saying, if there's any way this cup may pass from me, right? Let this cup pass from me. I think this is the same prayer, or similar prayer. Let this cup pass from me, John's version. Father, save me from this hour. Period. Then he goes on to say, but for this purpose I came to this hour, which is very much this, the equivalent of, nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. So, Father, save me from this hour. But, for this purpose I came to this hour. So I think in a way Jesus is out loud speaking, speaking his mind, speaking his thoughts about this, as we see recorded elsewhere. So that was one. Like I said, it's just a matter of changing it from a question mark to a period, and it makes more sense to me. It lines up with what we see in the other Gospels. Now, John and the other Gospels don't always line up, and we can't always make them line up. We try, and it's been tried for centuries. Okay. And I know maybe you think I should try harder, and it doesn't always work. He simply puts that temple incident at the beginning instead of at the end. He had reasons for that. We're also going to see actually next week, he puts Jesus' death on a different date. Not just like, a different time of year or something, but like the day before the others say that it happened. The preparation for the Passover, not the Passover day itself, but that's for next week. We'll get there. But anyway, this is one of those things that would seem different, but I don't think it actually is. I think he's actually praying the same prayer he's prayed that we have recorded in the other Gospels, or a similar version of that. And then it says, then a voice came from heaven saying, I have both glorified it and I will glorify it again. Now, can you imagine a voice from heaven? This is the voice we always want to hear. Lord, should I do this or do that? You should do this. This actually happened, and it wasn't considered strange, or we get all kinds of crazy stuff in the news, right? If you're watching the media these days, the news, you see all kinds of crazy stuff going on in the world. You don't see voices from heaven. Here's a story about another voice that came from heaven. But back in 2,000 years ago, a voice from heaven wasn't like an everyday occurrence. But it also wasn't something that would have been like, oh, that just doesn't happen. Voices from heaven are recorded throughout the Old Testament. Moses and Abraham clearly hearing a voice from heaven. Speaking with angels was a common thing. In other Jewish writings, in fact, Josephus, you can read, and I encourage you again to read Josephus's works, because there's great history of what happens right after what we have in the New Testament. What happened to the Jewish people right after that, but and also during. Interesting background stuff. But anyway, he also records voices from heaven in the temple as they were departing, getting out of the temple before it was destroyed. So these kinds of things were fairly common in that time to hear, and at the very least record having heard. It's something that was pretty interesting. Here's how the people responded, verse 29. So, voice from heaven, I have glorified it, and I'll glorify it again. Therefore the people who stood by and heard it said that it had thundered. Others said, an angel has spoken to him. Okay, so no doubt they hear something from the heavens. That's not really being disputed by the crowds. They're going, whoa. Okay, everybody kind of caught that. And here's Jesus' response to it. He says, Jesus answered and said, this voice did not come because of me, but for your sake. Now is the judgment of this world. Now the ruler of this world will be cast out. And I, if I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all peoples to myself. This he said, signifying by what death he would die. He would be crucified, lifted up. So a number of things being said in this passage, and I'm not going to try to unwrap them all. I'll just be honest up front. I'm not going to try to unpack everything here. We'd be here all day with some of these things. Clearly, Jesus is speaking about judgment coming. We know as he's lifted up on the cross, we understand now that sin is judged. Maybe that's what he's referring to as the judgment of this world, the sin in this world. That makes sense to me. What is a maybe trickier one is he says, now the ruler of this world must be cast out. And by ruler, who's he speaking of? Who's the ruler of this world? And I think many of us would probably think, well, he's probably talking about Satan. He's been called the prince of this world in other places. So is he speaking of Satan? If he is speaking of Satan, he says that this world, it's time. Now the ruler of this world will be cast out. Does that mean Satan was cast out? If so, where? And if Satan has been cast out, where is he? Right? I mean, is he still in the place where he was cast out? And does that mean he's not prowling around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour? You might get some answers this week if you read Revelation 20. And you might also get some more questions by reading Revelation 20. But that's a place that might speak to, you might get some more understanding of that. Go to Revelation 20. Has Satan been cast out? If so, where? And where is he now? Kind of a thing. I've got plenty of thoughts about that, but I'm not going to go into that. But clearly Jesus is speaking of there's judgment coming to this world. The ruler of this world is being cast out. I mean, things are going to change. I'm taking care of Jesus is going to take care of his spiritual enemies. Right? That's what he's going to do here. As it says in Colossians. Oh, hi, honey. How you doing? Daddy's preaching. I got a visitor here. Yeah, say hi. Yeah. No, we're not having any fries, though. But anyway, so another interesting statement that comes up here. This is the first. Verse 32, he says, and I, if I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all peoples to myself. John clarifies it by saying when he's lifted up, he's talking about that he'll be crucified, right? He's literally lifted up from the earth on a couple beams. But what does he mean by I will draw all peoples to myself? So if let's say, when I am crucified, I will draw all peoples to myself. What does that mean? Did he mean he's going to save everyone? If John is clear about anything in his gospel, he's clear about a number of things. And if he's clear about anything, he's clear that not everybody receives Jesus. In fact, most don't. So I don't know that John is here saying that Jesus is planning to draw and save all people. He uses the phrase all people. What does he mean by that, though, that he's going to draw all peoples to himself? It can't mean salvation. At least, certainly in John's gospel, that's made clear. People make their choice. Some choose him. Most don't. His own did not receive him, right? So maybe he's talking about he would draw all people's attention to him. That he will become the focal point. His crucifixion will become the focal point of history, and therefore all people's attention and the purpose of life all comes to this moment that he's about to experience. Maybe that's what he's saying there. I'm not exactly sure. It's one of those verses, though. Okay, girlies, you got to get back out. Okay, please head out and close the door. Thank you.
Why?
Make sure you close the door. Thanks.
Why, Dad?
I'll talk to you later because Daddy's doing his sermon. Okay, close the door. Talk to you later. Now, verse 34. Here we go. The people answered him, we have heard from the law that the Christ remains forever. And how can you say, the Son of Man must be lifted up? Who is this Son of Man? So the people have questions, right? Then Jesus said to them, a little while longer, the light is with you. Walk while you have the light, lest darkness overtake you. He who walks in darkness does not know where he is going. While you have the light, believe in the light, that you may become sons of light. These things Jesus spoke and departed and was hidden from them. So he hides out again. So they want to know how, we've heard about the Christ who is to come. We've heard about Messiah who's to come. How can you tell us, how could he die? Right? What do you mean he's going to be lifted up? What are you talking about? It doesn't make sense. And Jesus in this moment doesn't take the opportunity to explain the power of the resurrection. Well, you see, the Christ is going to die, but he's going to be resurrected. Remember Lazarus just like a couple of weeks ago, not even a couple of weeks ago? Remember how that happened? This is how it's going to work. He doesn't explain that to them. It's one of those places, again, where I'm like, Just a few, little words here, Jesus, and everybody would understand. But he doesn't. Instead, what he does is he gives what we might call today an altar call. An invitation to walk in the light while the light of the world is with them. So he's given kind of a last chance, for some of these people. Or a last chance to respond to his personal invitation, right, out loud. This was a limited time offer. We already know how this is going to work out because John told us up front. And in the prologue, he said, "And the light shines in the darkness." This is Jesus. He shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. Doesn't just mean didn't understand it, but didn't grasp it, couldn't get a hold of it, and didn't receive. Right. So this is again one of these themes that John introduced early on in the prologue, so that we would have a key. So when we get to something like this, we already know how this is going to play out. Even as we're going through the story, we kind of know the ending already from the beginning, so that we can understand and appreciate, I think, the tragedy all the more of Jesus' own people as a whole not receiving him. Many did. Even in his time, many were. And then, of course, we know at Pentecost, thousands and thousands, daily, of Jewish people are being added as believers. But as John reports it years and years down the road, his own did not receive him. But those who did. So there are some, but for the most part, it's enough to say his own did not receive him. Then in verse 37 now, but although he had done so many signs, and this is the tragedy, although he had done so many signs before them, they did not believe in him, that the word of Isaiah the prophet might be fulfilled, which he spoke. Now, John hasn't done a lot of Old Testament quotes. Matthew, Mark, Luke, they do that a lot. They say, so was fulfilled this, and so was fulfilled that. We don't get much of that from John, but here's one of them. Lord, this is from Isaiah now. Lord, who has believed our report? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? Therefore they could not believe, because Isaiah said again, he has blinded their eyes and hardened their hearts, lest they should see with their eyes, lest they should understand with their hearts and turn, so that I should heal them. These things Isaiah said when he saw his glory and spoke of him. So John is there noting that Isaiah prophetically saw what would happen in Jesus' day and spoke of it, hundreds of years before. Now here's another little tricky one to fit into a neat and tidy doctrine. It is fit into doctrines, but I don't think they're neat and tidy. And this is back to stuff we've covered before, and so I'm not going to say a whole lot about it, but we've already talked about this in John. And here it comes up again. Does God make certain people believe, choose them ahead of time, make them believe, predestine them to believe, and by doing so also choose some people who will not believe? You will not believe. You will believe, you will not believe. Is that something that God does? Some Christians say yes. Some doctrines say yes. And this would be a proof text from Isaiah. This would be one that's used often for that, as is Ephesians and, of course, Romans 9, 10, 11. But we've come across this idea, but throughout John, the burden is on the believer. He does have these statements in here that would seem to say that God plays a part in who is drawn and who will come to Jesus. But at the same time, the whole point of the book is to convince people, to persuade them to believe. Is there somehow, what's going on there? Hard to sort out. Hard to fit into a neat and tidy doctrine that you can just say, oh, I packaged that up, that works. Because it seems to say here, and here's the tricky bit, seems to say here that God blinds some people, blinds their spiritual eyes so they can't see. He hardens some people's hearts so that they cannot respond to him. Similarly to what we read in the story of Moses and Pharaoh, and it will say God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Sometimes it'll say Pharaoh hardened his heart. Sometimes it'll say God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Well, which one is it? And I think this goes back to the stuff I was talking about back in the Jesus Lens series, going through the Old Testament, trying to understand the Old Testament. Now that we know Christ, now that we know the end of the story, how do we go back and reinterpret the beginning of the story? Sort of like oh, what's that movie, The Fifth Sense? That once you get to the ending, then you have to go back and reinterpret the rest of the story. It makes sense. Similar with the Old Testament. But one of the things I talked about with, in particular, judgment in the Old Testament, is I believe God steps back when he judges. I don't believe he jumps in and then goes, I think he actually steps back. Where he was protecting, he now is hands off. Where he was preserving, now he turns away. And he will allow forces that want at us all the time. He will now allow them. Okay. I've warned, and I've warned. This is the stories throughout the Old Testament. I've warned them. Just grace, grace, grace. They're not responding. And so now I will hand them over to judgment. I will hand them over to what it is that they want, to the consequences that come with what they want. They refuse to accept what I have for them, so I will give them what they want. And I think this is the way God works. It's similar to what you read in Romans 1, the end of Romans 1 from Paul. It talks about God giving people over to a debased mind, and I think it's just this idea of, if this is what you really want, I've talked to you, Jesus has talked to these people over and over and over and over again. If you just are going to refuse, then I will let you refuse. I won't force you to believe. I won't force you to understand. I will give you that freedom to choose. And just delivers us over. If blindness is what you just can't let go of, and you got to have your blindness, then I'm going to let you have your blindness. If a hardened heart is something that you're going to hang on to, and I can't convince you otherwise by what I do, Jesus' miracles, by the words that I speak, by offering over and over again light, if you prefer darkness, then I'm going to leave you to darkness. And to me that makes a lot more sense, that God will hand us over to those things that we desire. And if it's a hard heart, if this is where we want to go and we're just going to hold on to it, then I think he's going to say, there you go. And that makes a lot more sense to me, that God would work in that way. Not that God would ahead of time harden a heart and say, okay, I want you to believe in me because God desires that none should perish. I believe that. So that doesn't make sense to me. That someone who desires none should perish would beforehand make them so that they refuse to believe so that they will perish. That just simply isn't even logical. So this makes the most sense to me, that what Isaiah and John are saying is God is handing them over to spiritual blindness. God is handing them over to their hard hearts and saying, this is what you're going to hang on to, then of course you're not going to see, you're not going to believe. But I won't force you to believe. Verse 42. Nevertheless, even among the rulers, many believed in him. So here's some good news in John. And we get these bursts of good news. Many believed him, even among the rulers, the religious leaders. But because of the Pharisees, they did not confess him, lest they should be put out of the synagogue. Remember the man born blind who comes and he's cast out of the synagogue? His parents wouldn't stand up for him and for his story because they were worried about being cast out of the synagogue. Same thing here. The Pharisees were powerful. They could cast you out so you could no longer come worship, and you would be an outsider to the faith, which is an outsider to being a Jew. This would have been a horrible thing to be cast out. It's basically the end of your life as you know it, to be put out of the synagogue. For they loved the praise of men more than the praise of God. So now we have some people who are believing, and these are upper rulers, religious leaders, and they're believing now. They're convinced, but they won't confess it. They won't say, I believe in Jesus. They won't drop everything and go follow him because they're afraid of the Pharisees. They're afraid of being cast out of the synagogue. They're afraid of losing their positions. They're afraid of losing their influence. And John is speaking pretty brutally here to these people. He's not really giving them, and this is John. John, if you read his other letters, 1, 2, and 3, very black and white. He doesn't leave a lot of room for, well, they kind of, can't you understand how it's difficult? He's just like, you're either with Jesus or you're not, man. And this is a brutal thing, because this would include, and maybe even be pointing a finger at a guy like Nicodemus in the story, who's come at night right? And John is careful to say he came at night. And we haven't seen Nicodemus. He's raised some things before, like, hey, maybe we should give this guy a minute, and been mocked for it. But then remaining a Pharisee and not changing. And this is John, I think, saying, people have to get off the fence. You can't be a part-time Christian or a seasonal Christian. And for guys like Nicodemus, this is what Jesus was saying, where you can't put the new wine in old wineskins. It'll burst. And so you can't remain in that old Pharisee form with your law, with your traditions, and maintain that and follow Jesus. This was decision time. And so John's just calling out some of these guys. Like, some of them believed, but they were afraid. They weren't real followers. They weren't about to be real followers. They chickened out. For Nicodemus, though, I will say, as spoiler alert, he helps bury Jesus after the crucifixion. So I think for Nicodemus, and when we get to that point, I'll be sure to note that Nicodemus makes the bold move. I think in some ways to risk, he's certainly risking his career, he's risking his name to be one who's willing to bury this heretic, this, false Christ, as the Pharisees would have seen him. And I think Nicodemus sticks his neck out in the end. But at this point anyway, he's not willing to do it. And John's pointing that out. And then in verse 44, then Jesus cried out. Now remember, it said Jesus ducked out. The last we heard from Jesus, before some commentary, was that he ducked out of there. But now he kind of comes back around from wherever he was and cries out in a loud voice and said, "He who believes in me, believes not in me, but in him who sent me." Nothing new. He's been saying that all through John. "And he who sees me, sees him who sent me. I have come as a light into the world, that whoever believes in me should not abide in darkness. And if anyone hears my words and does not believe, I do not judge him, for I did not come to judge the world, but to save the world." And this echoes John 3, the very things he spoke to Nicodemus, right? "He who rejects me and does not receive my words has that which judges him. The word that I have spoken will judge him in the last day. For I have not spoken on my own authority, but the Father who sent me gave me a command, what I should say and what I should speak. And I know that his command is everlasting life. Therefore, whatever I speak, just as the Father has told me, so I speak." That whole passage there should seem like so familiar, right? As we've gone through John, this is a recap. This is basically Jesus' summary statement. All the themes are there. Look at these words and themes that are just in that little passage that we've seen throughout John over and over and over and over again. Belief, sees. I talked about that last week, that seeing was more like experiencing, not just visually, but it's an experience with Jesus to see him. Light, darkness is an obvious one. Abide, judgment. He uses world, reject, or receive. Both those words are in there. The word, which is one of the first words in the book of John, right? In the beginning was the Word. Here we are with, again, that the words that he has spoken will judge them in the last day. Everlasting life, another theme that we see throughout John. So this is Jesus' summary statement, if you will, in the book of John. Here's what I've been teaching. Kaboom. And he cries it out in a loud voice in, 6 sentences or so. So this should be all old hat, as far as all these themes. Darkness is where here's what he's saying. Darkness is where we naturally abide. This is the world that we live in. It's in darkness. Light saves us from darkness. Jesus is the one who offers that light. People will be judged according to their response to Jesus' words. Will they believe that he is the Son who's been sent into the world to offer everlasting life? Will they believe that? If so, we abide with Jesus. If not, we abide in that darkness where we've always been, which will only get darker. These are the only two options, to abide in Christ or to abide in darkness. And again, John is very black and white. He doesn't leave room for, well, I'm kind of a Christian, but I also really like, this. I grew up in this religion. I also like some of the stuff Jesus said. John doesn't leave any room for that. You either abide in Jesus, which is a full-on thing, like he just said about those religious leaders who were afraid to confess Christ, so they weren't really following. And even as Jesus said, he who serves me will go where I go, right? Not hide out, not be away, not do something else. You're either full into Jesus or you're remaining in your darkness. Those are the only two options. And this is the repeated message of John. Okay, it's decision time, right? This whole book is meant to make to persuade you to come about to a decision. I'm either going to abide in Jesus, which is full on, or I'm going to remain in darkness with the hard heart, the blindness, spiritual blindness, and see what happens, right? So these are basically Jesus' last words to the crowds, his last big statement to them. He's going to now be speaking to his disciples for the most part. This is his last call out. Like I said, it's more almost like an altar call of his ministry, right? He's offering to save them from darkness, to save them from the wages of sin, to save them from themselves. In fact, as I've shared before, the history, what happens to these very same people and their children 30 years later. Okay, so it was them and their following generation. They rose up against the Romans. They decided, we've had it with the Romans. Some things led up to that. Eventually they revolt against Roman occupation, and they lost, right? In fact, it's estimated that over 1 million Jewish people died in those 4 years. They call it the Jewish Wars. That over 1 million died. And it wasn't just at the hands of the Romans, it was the hands of each other also. They were divided. There were factions, and they were divided against themselves. It was just a disaster. I think this is what Jesus was speaking of when he clean out the demon from the room, and then 7 more come back, and then the person's in even worse shape than he was before. I think that's what happens. Is Jesus came to Jerusalem, clears out the demon, if you will, and they left that vacuum. They didn't abide in him, and so it just got worse. And so yeah, over 1 million dead, 97,000 or so are taken prisoners and scattered throughout the Roman Empire. This is where you get your slaves, your gladiators, your all that kind of stuff, or people who did survive this revolt are just carried off as slaves. Thousands starved, and again, this is because of the factions. They burned up all the food, to spite each other, and it's a great read. Josephus's work. It's a sad and horrible, tragic tale, and Josephus says something to the effect of, this was our own fault. We brought this on ourselves. He was a Jewish writer, and he says, we brought this on ourselves. This whole terrible thing. But it ends with Jerusalem sacked, the temple burned down to the ground, then all that's left now is the Western Wall. And that's from that event. And so, but these people were offered light, right? We can't remove Jesus' story from the history that surrounds it. And Jesus offers them light in their darkness, and they preferred the darkness. They didn't comprehend the light he was offering. They didn't grasp it. They didn't take it. They did not receive him as a whole. They preferred their blindness. So Jesus is offering a real hand here. This is and this is why it helps to know also what's going on and what will happen historically for these people, these very same people. Is he's not just offering a spiritual hand to say, hey, you want to be saved in the afterlife. He's saying, I'm ready to save you now. Because salvation is something we have to understand is happening now. It doesn't begin in eternity. It begins now. Same with judgment. Judgment isn't something that Jesus always just reserves for the last day. The judgment isn't always something that's going to happen in the afterlife. It will. But it also begins now. Judgment begins now. As Peter says, it begins in the house of God. But judgment, the consequences of our choices happen here also. It's not just something saved for the afterlife. And Jesus is very, I think, just dealing with something that was going on with these people. He knew what was going on with these people. That's why he weeps over Jerusalem, right? How long I've wanted to gather you like a hen with her chicks, but you reject me. You would not let me. You would not allow me. Another reason why I can't believe that he chooses some and doesn't choose others. for salvation. But something interesting also that we can know about this is when the Romans come throughout Judea, in response to this revolt, and they wipe everybody out. Jericho and Jerusalem, everybody's wiped out. The Christians that were living in Judea fled. They went to a place called Perea, which is over where John the Baptist had been doing his ministry on the east side of the Jordan River. So that's where tradition and the stories say that the Christians left. They got out of there. Just like Jesus told them to do, right? We reread Matthew 24 this week, along with Revelation 20. Reread Matthew 24, and Jesus tells you, when you see the abomination that causes desolation, and, if you're on the rooftop, get down, get out of town, head to the mountains, right? Don't go back for anything. You don't have time. He wasn't speaking, as many people understand it, to be a future thing. And maybe it's got a dual fulfillment or something, but most certainly this is what occurred to these people within 30 years. As he told them, all these things will come upon this generation. And it did, and so they got out of town. Those who listened to him got out of town and survived. We don't have record of great numbers of Christians dying in this revolt, throughout these Jewish wars. Once they saw what was going on, they got out of there. And they were safe. They were safe there in Perea. So reread Matthew 24 this week, knowing what happens to the Christians and what happens to these people who were offered light, who were offered a salvation that wasn't just, your soul, your eternal soul. I don't mean just, but it was today. 30 years within the next 30 years. It was almost immediate in their time. I'm ready to save you from destruction that will happen now. I mean, this was, the people starved. It wasn't just like they just died. They starved to death. So many of the people, they were, mutilated by their own people who just went insane. These factions were led by madmen. Like I said, just demon possessed, I believe. This whole thing, and the stories of the women who cooked their children, and this stuff came from the Old Testament too. And they're in those sieges. That's what would happen. It happened. These people, Jesus offered them a handout, and they refused, and that's really sad to know. But this is why it's important to realize that there's nothing more practical than Jesus' teaching. When he taught, in fact, that's how he ends the Sermon on the Mount, right? He says, "Blessed are those," and do not worry and do not judge, and goes on about all those things that we read in the Sermon on the Mount. And then he says, if you do these things, then when the winds come and the waves and all that kind of stuff, the floods rise, you will stand firm. But if you don't do these things, if you just go, that was interesting, and do your own thing, then you're going to be toast. And it's so practical. He's not just, again, it's not just talking about this is, your eternal soul kind of a situation. You talk about, if you follow my ways, you will live, you will thrive in the midst of trouble. Yeah, and here are these, the great example historically. Those Christians all in Judea, they all fled like he told them to. They listened to what's recorded in Matthew 24, and they got out of Dodge, and they survived that whole thing. And that's because they followed Jesus' teaching. So practical. Those were crazy times. Like I said, it's a great read. It's a sad and tragic read also. Those were crazy times, and reflecting, of course, where we are now. This is, if you're watching this years down the road, this is 2020, the summer of 2020, and this is the year when COVID-19, big kind of flu pandemic, hit the world, and lots of people were dying, and there was lots of political drama around it, and not just in our country, so it's not just a United States thing, but all over the world there were protests going on, and people just have had it with this and had it with that, and clashes, and it just, like, the world's going crazy. That's where we are right now as I speak this sermon. Stuff's going all over the place. If you ask me, speaking of Romans 20, I spoke about it, half hour ago, but Romans 20 talks about, at the end of the 1,000 years, Satan is released from the pit, from the bottomless pit. If you ask me, I think he's been released. I think the 1,000 years are up, and he's going to town. But of course, that's probably what people thought when there was, what we now call World War One. They were like, oh, this is it. This is the end of the world. Like, no, actually, we've got another one of these. And then a Cold War, and then some other wars, and then, COVID-19. But anyway, the world is so clearly living in darkness. These are dark days. But the world always has. Again, look at the last just 100 years. But then you go back before that. We even have a time that we call the Dark Ages. We didn't talk about dark days today. There were the Dark Ages. And the Middle Ages of just like, sloughing through mud. This is just life in the mud. And for hundreds of years, dark days then. These are dark days also. Even in the midst of, even though, the world has, we have everything. At least in America, we have everything. But these are dark times all the same. And Jesus, we see here, offers light. And as I've said before in this series, his people offer light, and we shine as a light in the darkness as we abide in him. And that light, so clearly, so obviously, the metaphor is the opposite of darkness. It doesn't blend into darkness. It doesn't work alongside the darkness. It's just the opposite of the darkness. It's a completely different thing. And that's what the light's meant to be. That's what we're meant to be in this world. And so the question that I have now for us, and for us to be thinking about, is how are we going to shine in the darkness of these days as Christians? How do we stick out? How will we look different than this dark world? There are plenty of ways to look the same. Again, you watch the news and you see people shouting at each other in these protests, and both sides are shouting at each other, and you wonder how many of them claim the name of Jesus. But firstly, what we've got to do, instead of going through, I thought, I was going to end the sermon with a bunch of what we can't be doing. But what we need to do is to be filled with the Holy Spirit. And you go, okay, that's obvious, that's a good one. But the truth is, if we're not abiding in Christ, if we're not filled with his Spirit, if we don't have him working through us every day, every moment of every day, then we tend to resort to what comes naturally, which is, and what's going on around us. Join the ranks of the angry and the irritated. They're all over the place. They come into the Home Depot every day, the angry and the irritated, and they're upset, about this and that, and shouldn't have to wear a mask, or you should have to wear a mask, right? And people are angry and irritated, and instead of joining those ranks, we've got to be filled with the Spirit and say, no, how can we be light in the darkness that is so clearly prevailing right now, or seems to be prevailing, is everybody's fed up with each other and willing to fight about it. People are shooting each other over this mask stuff, stabbing people. It's just crazy. I believe one way, as I've talked about before, is that Christians are called to be peacemakers. Blessed are the peacemakers. I don't think Jesus was like just throwing out some hippie talk, right? This is like, blessed are the people of this world who step in the middle, who don't just jump on a side, masks, no masks, or, and just start shouting and yelling, at the other side. And you guys know what I'm talking about, with the protests that are going on these days, anti-police and anti-this and racism and all these different issues coming to bear again. I thought we'd gotten over some of these things, and clearly we haven't. But as Christians, we're called to be peacemakers in the midst of this. And this is something I've been praying for myself, just going to work these days, going to the Home Depot, and already there have been a few incidents that just have caused me to think, I've got to be prepared in my mind to be a peacemaker. Even at work, it's not as simple as go to work and get some people the parts they need for their plumbing project. We've had people shouting. I've came in from the back of the store the other day, hearing people shouting and cursing and just ugliness at each other over the mask thing. Somebody come in without a mask, and there was a man who's wearing his mask saying, what are you doing in here? Kill us all. And he was screaming, and she's screaming back and cursing, and they're in each other's faces. Ugly. And anyway, so that was handled before I really, was able to step in. They kind of walked away from each other. But what is it? It made me think, I've got to pray to be ready in my mind, to be ready ahead of time to be a peacemaker. Not to jump in kind of off the cuff and go, okay, now what do I do? well, I just, side with somebody or whatever it is. I've got to be ready ahead of time so that I don't get caught up in emotion, because that's what happens with a lot of people too. The other people who did jump in, other employees who were involved, were shouting and yelling and threatening, call the police on you guys, and we're gonna da da da. They're trying to help, but it wasn't light. It was just the same kind of. It was just darkness of a different sort. It didn't stick out as peaceable, as healing. It just was more of the same. And but as I've said, I think we need to have this in our minds ahead of time, and I think we need to be prepared mentally, spiritually, before these things occur. Loving our enemies isn't something that we can just do. The moment an enemy strikes, and then go, oh, well, I'll just love him. Likely, we're going to resort to what comes naturally, defensiveness and other things, striking back. But if we've got things in mind, I will refuse, to strike back at my enemy. I will pray for my enemies. I will. And it's in our minds ahead of time. Then much more likely we're going to do it, right? If we are preparing ourselves for our target, which is in this case to be a peacemaker, then we're looking at what it is to be a peacemaker and setting ourselves like playing darts, right? You want to hit the bullseye, and the bullseye for us is to be a peacemaker in this world. It's one of them. And so we're aiming, and that means we're looking at that bullseye, right? You're not going to hit the bullseye like this, which is what we might think we can kind of get away with. But we can't. We've got to be ahead of time. I'm going to be a peacemaker. Lord, I'm here to bring peace in this world. Give me your spirit. Your spirit is love, joy, peace. Give me that every day so that I'm ready should a moment arise when I'm needed, that I can be called upon to bring light into the situation. So I think so much of this for us needs to be a preparedness, purposed in our minds ahead of time to be peacemakers in this world rather than agitators. There are enough agitators. And that's for me, I tend to, that's my natural, is to strike back. Somebody comes at me and I, verbally, and I tend to get back at them, and I tend to get sarcastic and brutal, mean. I can't do that if I'm going to shine as light, and Christ doesn't do that, and so I have to have Him working through me, and be prepared ahead of time to have that mindset. You take over, and just be prepared ahead, aiming at that bullseye of being a peacemaker in the world. We've got to be purposed to be peacemakers. We've got to be purposed in these dark times to love our neighbor, which is an obvious one, classic. And just in the state of things today, we got to love our neighbor, whether they're black or white, whether they are liberal or conservative, whether they are mask-wearing or maskless. In these days, we've got to love these people, and I suggest that we look to Scripture for what love is, rather than because that word, of course, is thrown out all over the place. What love is? Well, I'll love him. What does that mean? I'm going to be, emotional somehow with them. I'm going to stare into their eyes and fall in love with them. What do we talk about? We say love. Well, you guys know this one. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. The world is filled with boasters. It's not love. It's not the way of Christ. It is not proud. And a lot about pride these days too, in the wrong places. It is not rude. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered, and it keeps no accounts of wrongs. The easily angered is the world, the darkness is just right now, everybody's so easily angered that people seem to have no patience with one another. Just attack instantly on the first thing anybody says or does. Love takes no pleasure in evil, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things. It means it puts up with all things. Believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never fails. The world needs love, Christ's love. Again, this isn't a kind of a 60s love. This is the love that comes from the Holy Spirit, that is able to love enemies, that is able to take to love people into coming to our side, to our way of thinking, rather than beating them into our way of thinking. And I can keep going with all the other things we need to be in this world, right? What it means to follow Christ, what it means to be filled with the Spirit. Sorry, something's in my eye. This is an interesting morning. I could go on about what it means to be joyful in this world, and the effects that has. True joy, the joy of the Holy Spirit. What it means to be gentle. That's another of the fruit of the Spirit, right? Gentleness. And it might be interesting this week to just think about, who would you describe as gentle? Think of somebody, media person, somebody that that might be in leadership or have some influence. Who would you describe as gentle in this world? It's hard to come across those who are truly gentle. Our heroes, the world's heroes, are not gentle, right? They basically win by doing the same kinds of things the enemy does, but just do it to them. Gentleness isn't really lifted up in our culture, so we don't see a lot of gentleness. But we're living in this world that's filled with violence and abuse and threats. And what effect might gentleness have on those things? We have to believe that we make a difference. If every Christian was gentle, truly gentle, think of what influence we might have, how that might change things. If gentle people showed up at these protests, if gentle people were in leadership at any level, whether it's political or these protests or whatever it is, gentleness. Wow. What God might do is light in the darkness. But this is what we can do. This is what's left to us to do as people. So this is all just to remember, this is what we can be praying about. We are ambassadors of Christ, and so we've got to remember that when we go shopping at Costco, when they ask us to put on a mask at Safeway or Home Depot, whether you believe it's necessary or not, or whether it infringes on your freedom. I need to look up some words here before I say them. Think about what you're doing and how that speaks to who Christ is. Same thing when we're on social media. And I got off of Facebook a few months ago. I've just had it. I don't trust Facebook anymore because I think everybody's just so quick to turn on people. It's becoming a place of tattletales and people looking for the littlest thing they can put somebody out. Pastors are being brought down for something they liked, all that kind of stuff. So anyway, I got out of there, but before you like something on Facebook, ask yourself again, be prepared ahead of time. Is this something Jesus would hit like on? Would Jesus click like, on his Facebook account? Would he endorse this? And that's what a like is. And that's at least how it's taken. Is as an endorsement of what it is, what it says, what it's about, and even who it came from, which we don't always check. You like something. Oh, that's funny. And then someone points out, hey, do you know who put that out? That was, the head of the, KKK or whatever. Like, I thought it was just a funny thing that didn't have anything to do with racism, but sometimes, it goes back to those kinds of things. So we got to be so careful with those things and ask, if I as liking this or sharing it, am I passing on something that Jesus would share and pass on with other people? It's a serious thing to be thinking about, because otherwise we just blend in with the darkness and we don't offer light. We offer something else. But we have to be prepared ahead of time. Otherwise, what comes naturally is agitation, frustration, the things everybody else is feeling in this darkness. And our job is to help people get through 2020. If we can see our role in this world right now as Christians, it's to help this world get through 2020. And that requires the light of Jesus, which is his teachings, which is his way of doing things. And so take that with you this week as you go out, to take seriously that we are ambassadors. And it's not something that we do, it's certainly not something that we hold over people, as we'll look at next week. Servants, being what it really means to be a servant. These are humble gestures that we offer. Gentleness is a humble position. Love is a humbling place to be. And to be a peacemaker is a humbling place to be, because you don't become the peacemaker by just being the bigger bully. You have to do something different. You have to act differently, come across differently, persuade people to respond with kindness. And we can only do that by being kind ourselves. So anyway, take that with you this week as you go shopping, as you get out, in there, and there's the mask wearers and the not mask wearers, as you're looking at, the news and the protests and the anti-blacks and anti-police and these lives matter, but these don't, but all lives matter, but really, whatever. And into all those debates and things. Whatever your role is in those things, let you have the mindset of being, how can I be a peacemaker in this? And the same, whatever comes personally in your family or those kinds of things also. Just be prepared. This is what we're called to be, is to shed light into the darkness. And there's no, at least in my time, I don't think there have been darker days than 2020. And so, what a time to shine. And this is all to God's glory that we do this. And so I invite you to be a part of that. Pray about it. Let this be, your purpose. I want to shine, in this dark world, and trust how Jesus will do that through you. Amen? Have a great week.